radio for the Agile community. www.Agile.FM. Thanks for tuning in into another episode of Agile.FM, and today I'm here with Pavel Dabrytski from Think Agile, and he is an Agile coach and trainer in Johannesburg. He was originally born in Belarus, and he is passionate about coaching, psychology, financial models, and that's exactly what I want to talk about here today with him. Welcome to the podcast, Pavel.
Oh, thank you very much, and I'm excited to be part of it.
All right, awesome. Let's jump right into this. I want to talk about these two topics with you, but before we go there, what's very interesting about your, let's say, career path is that you were born in Belarus and you grew up there, it's my understanding, and then you moved to Johannesburg. But on your LinkedIn profile, there is actually something, and please forgive my innocence here, but there's a language you speak that is Belarusian.
Yes. Well, so Belarus is a country in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. Not many people know about it, and today maybe it's a good thing, right? So it's one of the former Soviet Union republics. Mm-hmm. When Soviet Union dissolved, mm-hmm. These new 15 states were formed, including things like Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, right. Latvia, Lithuania. So I'm from one of those countries. Mm-hmm. So it's an independent country. We do speak Belarusian and we speak Russian as well.
How are these languages different? I'm just curious. Belarusian. I knew about the country, but that there is another language. How is this different? Is this a dialect or is this a completely different language?
Right, it's a completely different language, but they all from the same family. Mm-hmm. So the closest languages are Ukrainian and Russian. Okay. And in fact, because I speak Russian and I speak Belarusian, it's quite easy for me to understand Ukrainian. In terms of how close they are, so it's definitely not a dialect. So
it's
often
that, yeah.
Someone who just speaks one language, for example, someone from Moscow or St. Petersburg, they wouldn't necessarily understand Belarusian or Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. But if you know two of them, then it's quite easy. So when I talk about the languages, I often bring the example of Dutch and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is one of the languages in South Africa. They're very similar, and you would probably understand the other person, but you wouldn't be able to write a book in this language, right?
All right. So very diverse, and maybe listeners have learned something about that part of the world as well by tuning into Agile.FM. But then you moved to Johannesburg, South Africa, for weather and possibly other reasons, and you started a company or work in a company called Think Agile. You were a Scrum trainer, certified Scrum trainer with the Scrum Alliance, and how is the Agile scene in South Africa? Me, from being from New York, I don't have too many insights, but if you had to make a comparison to the US or Europe, what do you see down here in South Africa?
Yeah, so South Africa was the country where I first got introduced to Agile. So I was a developer when I moved in. I actually didn't move to Johannesburg. I moved to Cape Town first, and I spent 4 years there before moving to Johannesburg. I joined a company which was doing Agile at that time, specifically Scrum. And as you know, as a person new to that, as a developer, they set me through an introduction to Scrum. It was about 2 hours. And at the end of it, I was like, well, does it actually work? So, so I was like, it surely doesn't work. How can you estimate in story points and how people can easily inflate it? So that was an interesting experience for me to get introduced specifically in South Africa. But to your question, how different is that, or how advanced is that compared to other markets? I think maybe it's a few years behind, but we still have a very strong community. We have 2 big conferences, and we usually attract anything between 300 to 500 people for those conferences. So, for example, in 2017, the Agile 2017, we had 8 speakers from South Africa come in and present in Orlando. So I think community definitely is one of the stronger ones in the world. Mm-hmm. It's probably similar to the level of Australia.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the leading markets are the UK and the US, but we're not that far behind.
Okay, well, interesting. Okay. You just mentioned something about story points, and I wanted to dive into one of the 2 topics I mentioned earlier, the financial models, right? You seem to be very interested in these kind of things. You presented in 2016 at the Agile conference about this topic. And one of the things that really became clear to me when that sentence or that question I saw was, how much does a story point cost? How much does a story point cost, and do people actually put a price tag on something called story points? You just mentioned inflation. Just want to see how that all works out.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. And in terms of story points, I think as many trainers in the world, as many opinions about story points and using them, and is it a good thing or a bad thing. In my talk in 2016, I was specifically interested in using story points to make the life of accountants a little bit easier, right? Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting question you ask. Well, how much story point costs, or can we assign a monetary value to a story point, and is it what might it cause, and kind of does it have any positive or negative effect to that? So in terms of aligning incentives to story points, I think it's quite a dangerous thing, right? Because then it drives very wrong behavior, and you can have story point inflation, right? Because you're just driving story points. Mm-hmm. But in my talk, I was specifically talking about using story points retrospectively, so not incentives are future oriented, right? But you can use them retrospectively to capitalize software, all right? There is existing framework in something called IFRS and GAAP. IFRS is International Financial Reporting Standards, and GAAP is Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, saying if you have an asset, which software is in a way is an intangible asset, then you're not supposed to expense, you're not supposed to write off all the costs in 1 year, but you're supposed to distribute it across multiple years. Right. Of when the software is actually used. And it just generally, so you can have adequate financial statements. You don't have minus $100 million in 1 year and then
right.
So
distributed over the years.
Yeah, so that's what accountants want to do, and for that purpose, accountants love capitalizing assets as they're being developed. But the challenge with software development in Agile is those moments in time where the capitalization starts and when it finishes, right? It's a little bit blurred. Previously, if you look at waterfall, that concept evaluation, analysis, those are all the activities which are not capitalized because those are called research and development activities. So you're not sure yet if the software is going to be created or if it's going to be used. So there's actually a checklist of all the things which need to be in place to show feasibility of software, to show if management's got approval, if you have money, if you can make money out of it, or if you can get a benefit out of it. And it's quite clear, it's quite easy to do it in the waterfall project, saying, okay, when this phase finishes, then we can start capitalizing software. But the moment it hits production, we stop capitalizing software and we start expensing everything else as an operating expense, because you also need to do maintenance, right? But if you look at Agile, we're saying, okay, so spend a few weeks on starting up a project, and then you go and you try to release and deliver every sprint, or every few sprints, or even multiple times a sprint. So there's actually no 2 points in time where you can say, okay, I'm starting capitalization, and I'm finishing the capitalization process.
Right.
So that's a big challenge. And as you know, we were talking about story points, but there's another way. So there's another way to figure out what type of activities to capitalize and what type of activities not to capitalize. And story points kind of gives us a nice way into that. So, for example, in your sprint backlog, you might have user stories building functionality, but you also might have more technical product backlog items or even bug fixes.
Mm-hmm.
And technical product backlog items or bug fixes are more of operational expense, right? So you actually just need to figure out how many of your points per sprint are spent developing new features versus how many of the points per sprint developed, doing those technical maintenance activities. And then you figuring out total cost of a sprint, and you figure out how much of it is actually going into, being an asset in your books, in your accounting books. So that's one of the topics. Might sound a little bit complicated, but once people see the model, once they understand it, they're like, "Oh, thanks so much," because it makes everyone's life, even developers' life, managers' life, and even accountants' life is also much easier because they don't need to stress about figuring out all these crazy calculations and frameworks. Yeah.
Well, in your description of your talk, you actually say there is no accounting degree necessary, and I think you just did an awesome job of explaining that for people who do not have an accounting degree. Very easy, very easy. So, but there is definitely an effort. I don't know if you would agree with that, of inflation of story points, right? Coaching on a team level. That if you have a financial model associated with story points for capitalization, that there is no inflation, right? You really need to coach this quite nicely.
Yeah. So once again, it's how do you incentivize your people and what drives them, and so those type of methods I suggest, they are more of a how do I make everyone's life better, not how do I get more out of my developers, or how do I trying to make people trick people into working hard, because I think as a coach you realize, well, you cannot trick people into doing something. You can only maybe work around motivation, right? So get people excited, get people motivated, help them to build insights into how to be more effective, right? Help them to be more reflective.
Okay.
At work, yes.
Yeah. You have another interesting associated with the financial models. Before we go on to the other topic here, you have another thing which really popped out here for me, and that is a transparent financial governance. Does something like that even exist? I want to be honest with you. How does that look like in the way of financial models, the governance, financials, as you just said, accounting? Very often it's behind the scenes, right? And transparency to what? I wanted to see if that is a topic you had in your talk, or if that is something you feel like needs exploring within the industry.
Well, that's an interesting kind of angle to look at that, right?
Yeah.
So how do you bring your governance to be transparent, and why is it not transparent in the first place, right?
Exactly.
Because I think the whole point of governance is to bring transparency to your organizational processes, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think the challenge with governance, as it is right now, is that it almost like a function in the organization which is outsourced to just a group of people, and generally it's almost like this group of people being on a fence and everyone for the rest of the organization being on the fence. And to me, and as I was mentioning earlier, is all about bringing those different groups of people together so they can create those win-win situations for each other, so they making each other's life easier, right, rather than making each other's life more difficult, right? And that's that's the reputation governance people receive in today's corporate world, saying, governance is something we have to do, is something which is arbitrary, something which is not useful to my project. But if you think why it was put in the first place is to allow the shareholders of this company to have stronger control and supervision of company's processes and decision making.
Right.
So I think the solution to that is through facilitation, and facilitating all sorts of different conversations between different groups of people in an organization, and getting them to talk to each other and collaborate and solve those type of challenges and kind of bring creativity in those type of processes, which sometimes feel like stale processes, right? People say this governance framework was there for 30 years or 50 years, or this we've been doing it for so many years, we even forgot why we put it in the first place.
Oh yeah, very often, yeah.
Yes.
Does that impact also procurement? I'm not sure, you don't spell it out as something special, but I'm just curious if these procurement processes are also impacted by your models as well as by that kind of transparency.
Yeah, that procurement is very interesting. I have a story on that. I was working with one of financial institutions in South Africa, one of the biggest banks, and at some point, software teams find they're restricted by their infrastructure requirements, right? They're saying, well, we're ready to ship the software, but we don't have our infrastructure, so we don't actually have any servers to put our code onto, right? And so that particular company at some point had to go back to every single vendor of infrastructure and say, guys, we're doing Agile. We need to be faster. This is our new requirement, right? So we need to be able to assemble, create a virtual machine and spin it off in that amount of time. And it was a matter of days, not matter of weeks. Before that, it was 6 to 8 weeks to procure something. And they also said, are you ready for us to continue to work together? Because if you're not, we will keep on searching and looking. And I think it was a harsh question to ask your vendors, your procurement, but that's sometimes that's what's needed, right? To have to say, well, we're working together, but we need to continue working together, and we need to continue challenge each other. So because it's not about software anymore, right? So Agile is not about software anymore. And even at the conference I went recently, Agile 2017, a lot of conversations were about business agility, right? So it's Agile outside of business and agility of business holistically, right? So doing end-to-end, not just doing a software part of it. Because
you're absolutely right. But the procurement part is like very often it's the first step when agile companies make contact with a non-agile company to take over their transformation and start working with that organization, and that's where those contracts and agreements are being put into place way before an education took place. It's a very challenging topic, I would assume, right? To have these kind of procurement processes changed before even transformations take place.
Yes, and those contracts and those service level agreements are generally longer lived. So so you usually have an existing contract, an existing model, contracting model in terms of how to pay your vendors, all right? And you usually have a set of preferred vendors, and then Agile comes and says, well, okay, we don't work really well with this type of contract. We need to renegotiate the contracts. And there's an obvious resistance from people, from people in procurement, because that means, oh, I need to do more work, right? So because I had all these nice contracts and now I need to renegotiate the contracts. I need to get lawyers in to draft the new contracts, because those are all templates, right? So if you have one set of templates, you reuse them. And we ask an organization to create new sets of templates. But it's also scary for vendors because, well, we we've went through the sales cycle, we've got the contracts in place, and now you're telling us that you want to get out of them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting challenge the companies actually face.
Right. Oh, awesome. I wanted to explore both topics here you're passionate about, and I feel like let's switch over to the other one. I know this is a big transition here to the psychology of coaching. And I saw you actually in New York City, and you were talking about this topic. But obviously, listeners of this podcast might not have heard you or seen you in action. And one of the things you say is that it takes a good chunk of time. I'm not phrasing your statement here from you, but it takes a good chunk of time to become an agile coach. It doesn't come overnight. Why is that?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm a bit disappointed with the way we define coaching in agile community, and so generally, what I see the trend is Scrum Master is not cool anymore, right? So it's not cool to be a Scrum Master, and everyone wants to be an agile coach, and no one, maybe not no one, but a lot of people do not really understand what's the difference between a Scrum Master and Agile coach. And to many of us in the community, Agile coach is just, an Uber Scrum Master. Is someone who's just a little bit more experienced as a Scrum Master. In fact, that was my thinking when I first transitioned to Agile coaching. I was like, hey, well, Agile coaching is going to get me 20% more money, right? So you better be one. And it took me some time. I went on my own journey, understanding, well, what coaching is not, right? Coaching is not expert. Coach is not expert. So coaching is not sharing your expertise and mentoring. Coaching is not consulting, right? It's a very special skill. And a lot of it is to do with facilitated development. So you need to be skilled at facilitating someone else's development. So it's a very unrewarding, probably post-heroic role where you don't get any recognition for your job. The person who you help to develop, right, the person who experiences the growth, they will get all the praise. And that what takes a long time, arriving at this mindset, arriving at these conclusions that coaching is a post-heroic skill. So coaching is not being an expert, not being the one to save the world, but helping other people achieve their best.
Right. It's kind of ironic, right? Because this word Scrum Master really has the word master in it, right? So compared to an agile coach, I agree with your assessment. There are some people who see that as a career path. I don't think that way. I think we share that, but there's definitely it's a strong word if you think about it, but it has become blurry in organizations because we're using the term all the time. Well, here's something I recently saw on television. Somebody actually activated their brains just before a sport event. They wanted to become really alert, and the person actually activated their brain, just get into action by licking a 9-volt battery. And that was that person's secret. You actually say that with some of those psychology of coaching, that we can actually stimulate the brain's creativity, not only activating it, but creativity. What's that all about?
All right. Yeah, so often, and as part of that particular talk, I talk about psychological needs and motivation.
All right.
So often the way we approach some improvements or goals is we shame ourselves into being better, right? It's always inner critic or someone, it's external regulation. Someone tells us what we need to do, all right? And often, because the change takes a long time, my clients need a high level of motivation, right? Something which is linked to inner values, or something which becomes part of the value system of that person, right? So how do you get there? So you can't get there by person thinking in the same way as they created the problem for themselves, right? So as they arrive at this situation, this problem or this challenge, you have to get them thinking somehow different, right? You get to activate a different part of the brain. And I'm not saying, oh, well, I'm not saying we have to, maybe stop thinking rationally and problem solving and start being creative. I'm just saying, if you are a creative person, maybe try to have more rational reasoning. If you are a rational person, what does reflective part of your brain thinks? And so it's all about different states of your brain. And it has been, a lot of research has been done and on that topic already, and a lot of different brain activation states. But that's what coaches do. They try to activate a different part of your brain, so it's almost like a different window to your brain, to your soul, where you can actually realize or have the true impact of the value of your goal improvement, and create a more innovative way of solving it, or create a better motivation for yourself to tackle the problem. So that's why creativity is important. And many coaches generate creativity in using different tools. For example, at one of the conferences, a person came to me and said, "Well, but what about the state of flow? Can I use a state of flow in my coaching sessions?" And I said, "Absolutely, as long as it helps your client generate insights and create an action plan and actually implement the change." People do drawings. Some of my clients respond really well to illustrating, their challenges,
right,
or illustrating themselves. And some don't like it. So then, I don't do that. So I think that's the tricky part, is to get to that particular tool or technique for your client, which helps them to really activate their creative brain.
So you're saying that some of those clients or team members out there, they're effective in the usage of certain parts of their brain, but they're not unleashing the entire spectrum. So basically, that would be a coach's job to find these other areas to unleash creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good. I mean, I have a question for you here, Pavel, towards the end of our podcast, and it's like, we talk a lot about motivation. Coaches do motivate. I think very often they're brought in to be a motivator. But what we often see is that there is short-term motivation, and there are certain tools for that. But how do you establish, or what are your tips and tricks for some listeners out there here, how to motivate long-term? Like,
yes.
An agile project is not a 2-week endeavor, and sometimes coaches come in early in a project and then leave a team while the project is continuing. But how does a long-term motivation actually kick in? I think that's very important.
All right. Yes, that's really good that you ask me. So generally, the lower level of motivation are all about external regulation. It's all about external motivation, saying, well, you'll get some sort of a reward or punishment for doing or not doing a particular task. And we know that, from our childhood, right? So no one wants to wash dishes and take the rubbish out. Right. Right. But similar things happen in the workplace, where, or you're only going to get your bonus if you deliver the software by the deadline, or any sorts of that. My latest is this big Agile organization wanted to introduce Agile, so they put in everyone performance reviews saying that 30% of your spend must be done in Agile way. And without people understanding what Agile is, and so it actually created a stressful environment, and it made people hate Agile from the beginning without even giving it a chance, because it's now part linked to reward and punishment. The true way of motivating people is to really linking it to the value system. Well, the one way is to find Agile as being instrumental to something. So, for example, I like Agile because Agile teams deliver faster and they have lower attrition rate, and generally they're happier. So Agile is an instrument, right? Is a tool of getting somewhere, and which you find useful. So the end goal is still attrition rate, or the end goal is still faster delivery, but Agile helps you there. That's a good motivation, right? But sometimes it doesn't work, because if you remove that high level of the goal, for example, faster delivery, if you don't need faster delivery anymore, then you don't need Agile anymore. So what's even better is complete integration, is where a person understands that Agile is a value system, and they align that value system with their own value system.
Right.
And I'll give you an example of that. I do Agile, right? I'm being Agile because working in collaborative teams and having everyone being heard is what I am, right? I like to be heard, and I want other people to be part of the conversation, and that's why we do Agile in the company. So that's a complete integration of Agile, Scrum value systems, right? We all talk about Agile Manifesto and Scrum values into your own value system and associating those two together.
Right. Oh, wonderful. Thanks for the example, and I think that makes all sense to everybody. And I just feel like we have touched on these two topics, and I hope that the listeners out there got an appetite of your repertoire of topics, because these are two different kind of topics here, financial models and the psychology of coaching. You presented on both of those topics. If people got an interest and want to connect with you, your Twitter handle is Pavel Dabrytski. That is Pavel Dabrytski. You can just Google his name, even with some spelling errors. I checked that before. Your name popped up, and people can make a connection with you. I hope everybody out there listening to this podcast had as much fun as I did speaking about these two topics with you. I want to thank you, Pavel.
And thank you very, very much for having me here.
All right, talk to you soon, and right. I'm sure we're gonna speak soon at some point again about any of these topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.